Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. This week, no surprises, we're still talking about coronavirus. We're still here in the IPA's working from home studios trying to work out when are we going to get out of this frozen phase that we're in, as there is something like 26 cases across Australia for the entire day. Is it time to start lifting restrictions? And what happens after that? To address these questions, we've assembled a crack team today, including some big brains who've already put together a soon-to-be-released book on how we find our way out of the current social and economic crisis brought on by the pandemic. I'm Scott Hargreaves, editor of the IPA Review, and in a moment I'll be introducing those big brains. But first I should mention that this program is brought to you by the Institute of Public Affairs, and if you're not already a member, please do join or donate to see how you can support this podcast and our research and do what you can to get Australia moving again. So first of all, let me introduce my regular co-host. He's an adjunct fellow at the IPA, but his day job he is at the RMIT University, Dr Chris Berg.
Thanks, Scott. It's exciting to be able to talk about a book that I've written on the podcast and introduce our co-authors and have a chat about that.
Yeah, no, terrific. And I will throw to one of those co-authors now, also an adjunct fellow at the IPA, but from RMIT University, Professor Jason Potts. Welcome, Jason.
Yeah, good morning, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you back. A rare treat, and but certainly a very timely one, given the importance of the issues that we're talking about. And, of course, we have another regular, which is the IPA Director of Research, Dan Wild.
G'day, everyone. Good to be back on.
Yeah, great to have you, mate. Great to have you. So we will start today talking about this new book. Today is Wednesday, the 22nd of April. There are some topical burning issues, but we'll talk about the book first, and then I think that'll give us a nice framework to actually examine what's happening in Australia right at the moment. Chris, take us away.
Yeah, so we've very urgently written up a book on how to unfreeze the economy. We're calling it Cryoeconomics, how to unfreeze an economy after a pandemic. And the argument is pretty simple, that the governments have, in the process of trying to deal with the pandemic, the governments have basically shut down our economies or really substantially reduced economic activity. In order to deal with the problems that causes, which is, of course, mass unemployment, they've had this idea that we can put the economy into hibernation, or we can freeze it, or we can suspend it, or we can put it into an induced coma, all these metaphors that we're seeing lying around. Well, our book is not about that decision, but it's about, okay, well, now that they've tried to do this, then how on earth are we going to unfreeze it? How are we going to get back to the prosperity we had in 2019? And there's really two parts, and I think we should talk about the first part initially, and I might throw to you, Jason. This is the idea of freezing an economy or putting an economy into hibernation, and our argument is that that's not really possible, but I might ask Jason just to have a little description of what we mean by freezing and unfreezing there.
Yeah, so the idea here is that we just want to pause time. In an ideal sense, we're going to deal with a public health crisis, and lots of economic activity involves putting people in proximity, which creates a public health hazard. So interestingly, the medical treatment for this disease is actually to stop the economy working. So that's the thing that everyone's decided to do, and there's a strong, that's an obvious thing that needs to happen. The problem is what happens after that, because what you've just done is we've frozen an economy, we've locked everything in place, all the contracts are shut down, all activity ceases other than the sort of things needed to urgently take place. But we've never ever done this before. Like, we've dealt with business cycles before, we've dealt with depressions and recessions and all sorts of business fluctuations that have come from inside an economy, where the role of public policy is to counteract that, to spend when for governments to spend when consumers don't, and that's that logic. But the idea of freezing an economy and then the idea that we snap our fingers and it just comes back out again, that has never ever happened before. So first of all, we're not sure what will happen when we try and unfreeze it. What the book is about is what we think will happen, and we're really worried about this, because what we expect to happen is that a lot of the contracts and interactions and connections will just have disappeared, right? They're not going to be relevant. A lot of the preferences and consumer demands will have changed in the meantime. And what's going to need to happen is a huge amount of rapid adaptation. And for that to happen, we need the institutional settings of the economy to be maximally flexible. We need enormous amounts of entrepreneurial adaptation to new circumstances. And we think that the actual policy response needed here isn't a standard sort of business cycle counter, fiscal or monetary sort of counter-cyclical policy response, but is actually much closer to a deep deregulatory response where the idea is to give the economy the flexibility it needs to adjust.
So I guess in that context, what we're trying to think about is what are the debates that we're going to be happen after we're out of lockdown. So, and I recognise that this is sort of one step ahead of where we are because, of course, governments are still in lockdown. But what we're seeing coming down the path is all these claims for we've spent so much money, now we need to spend even more money. We're going to need massive fiscal stimulus to boost demand like we did in the global financial crisis. Well, we think that that's precisely the wrong direction to go because it gets the problem precisely wrong. What we need to do is we need to get governments back out of the economy, and we need to allow entrepreneurs and businesses to adapt to the new post-COVID reality.
Yes, I think the authors have done a good job, Chris and Jason, on pointing out that it can't possibly reset to where it was on February 1 or March 1, that economies are such dynamic things, and some of the adaptations we've already seen that you've talked about. You make the point that some of them will become permanent, and so whatever's coming out of it's got to find a new way of operating, and so it needs the maximal flexibility to do that. It's both. We have a natural human desire, I think, to see things return to normal. But certainly, in a business sense, in a commerce sense, which is, I think, what we mostly focus on today, it's not going to be exactly like it was, and certainly the old nostrums that we'll just go down to Philip Lowe and ask him to print a bit more money, or a bit of modern monetary theory. The idea that those kind of things could actually take care of it are just risible, but they do need to be argued against.
The world is going to be incredibly different, and not just because of the pandemic, but because of all the stuff that we've learned during the pandemic. Really simple things like people who are learning to cook while they're stuck at home rather than going out to restaurants to eat. But also, we've basically just sent the entire white collar community of Australia to work from home. The companies that have done that have learnt about how to get them their call centers, their managers, all of it to function at home. We're not going to forget that information. We're going to lock in a lot of these new practices. And so the idea that we could have just frozen and pick up where we left off is obviously nonsense. Now, the really worrying thing is that we're trying to freeze these people in place. We're trying to freeze employers. That's the idea behind the JobKeeper scheme, to keep people in the same companies. Now, I think there's an argument for that, but we have to recognize there's going to be massive unemployment. There's going to be massive job losses the moment we unfreeze, and we've got to start thinking about that now.
Chris, can I just come in on that? I think it's actually worse than that, in the sense that what you've got is first of all, we're not going back. This so much has changed in terms of preferences and technology, but the vast technology shock here is something that I think has also been widely underappreciated. That what you've got is a massive acceleration of a whole lot of digital technologies that have been sort of building over the past few decades. And you see this very clearly in education. We're just universities, which for decades have been trying to sort of develop courses online and have really struggled with that, just suddenly got it together and have done that. Vast amounts of the consumer-facing economy have pivoted to digital in a very quick, rapid succession. So you've got right in the middle of this freeze, you've actually got this incredible acceleration of technological adoption. Now, that's the thing that creates these enormous business model challenges and entrepreneurial challenges to try and figure out how to rebuild businesses, and therefore jobs and other sort of parts of the economy will need an enormous amount of reconfiguration afterwards. So this notion that this freeze metaphor that we're going back to something that we had before is just wildly inaccurate and misleading. Instead, there's going to be an enormous need for rapid entrepreneurial adaptation across the entire economy. And what that means is that business models won't fit, regulatory environments and contexts won't fit, industrial organizational patterns won't fit, just massive. The economy right now in the middle of this freeze is in massive disequilibrium. And if we're going to come out of it in any sort of way that for the economy to then grow and strengthen and pay back the enormous debt that it will have incurred in just surviving this, we're going to need a far more entrepreneurial economy than anything we've ever had before. And this is the policy challenge.
Can I ask Dan just to spend a moment on this idea that we are in uncharted waters, which Dan, you've been the economic analysis your team's been keeping everyone up to date with. I mean, this is just unprecedented. The speed and the severity of what we've seen in terms of both official levels of unemployment and what are the real underlying levels.
Yeah, that's right, and I think it's far worse than what a lot of people first expected in terms of the scale of the job losses and also the pace of them. And I think most people are still in shell shock about what has happened, just in terms of the heavy nature of restrictions that have been imposed upon them, but also how quick they've happened. And really, it's just been done with the stroke of a pen. That's been one of the, I think, challenging components of this. There's been very little debate or scrutiny in Parliament or otherwise over a lot of these measures. In terms of the concept of hibernation, I completely agree that it is a bit of a false concept. You can't, put people's lives temporarily into hibernation and then have the government revivify them or thaw them out. And I would note that it was 3 academics from the Australian National University that came up with that concept, and only an academic, who's completely sheltered from any of the negative consequences of these government-imposed sanctions could think that people can just sit at their homes, and have the government build a bridge, which was the metaphor Philip Lowe used, and then come out the other side, completely unscathed and continue on as previously was the case. But clearly that's just not going to happen. There's a lot of people that are losing their jobs now will never ever work again, and a lot of people that are closing their businesses will never open those businesses again. So this is not just a crisis. I think this is a tragedy, and it's bordering on a humanitarian tragedy of biblical proportions.
Yeah, and I guess the question is, how do we deal with that? So that decision has been made, and what are the policy settings that we need to get us to at least mollify the effect of that tragedy, to get people back into work, and hopefully to get the economy back to the levels of prosperity, relative prosperity we saw in 2019. Now, our argument is the sort of policies that we were interested in before the crisis because they made us more prosperous. So things like cutting red tape and deregulation, things like lower, flatter, simpler taxes, things like labor market deregulation, and particularly, those are actually precisely important because they make an economy more flexible and more adaptive. For example, red tape that prevents you from entering a new industry or makes it hard or slow or expensive to change the way you do business is precisely the sort of red tape that is going to prevent us from employing people quickly after the crisis is over. Now, Scott Morrison, yesterday, I think it was, which was Tuesday, made a argument that when they have the budget, which has been moved to October, they'll be talking again about tax cuts and deregulation. Now, I think that's good. I support the government's attitude in that, but it better not be the same old deregulatory policies that we've seen year in and year out. which have been these sort of half-hearted, sort of tidy the statute books type things. I think the government needs to understand the scale of the problem, which is, to your point, Dan, the unprecedented nature of what they've done, the damage that this has taken on the economy and employers, and really have some big ambitions. Otherwise, we're just not going to be able to deal with the crisis.
Well, I think that's right. And it's also going to be, we are ultimately going to be facing, I think anyway, a pretty prolonged period of time where things like tourism is going to be heavily truncated, for example. It's unclear when the international borders will open again. And there is a significant component of our economy that is dependent upon tourism, on international students, on travel. It's not immediately apparent how those sectors will recover. If you look at what's happening in North Queensland at the moment, anybody that's employed in the tourism industry up there is just they've got taxis lined up outside airports just with no one to take anywhere because there's no one coming in to the country. So it does raise a broader issue that I want to touch on, and I would be interested in your views on this, which is I think what this economic collapse has demonstrated is that Australia has, going into the crisis, a very deep structural economic problems where we were heavily dependent upon a narrow number of sectors in particular. I'll give you an example. We had 2/3 of our economic growth since the GFC has been from population growth underpinned by mass migration, which is something that's not going to be sustainable in the decades to come. Now, that's the inverse of what was the case from the Keating recession to the GFC, when 2/3 of our growth came from productivity or labour force changes. So I think it's been, over the last decade, really quite lazy government at the state and Commonwealth level that has not engaged in any kind of structural reform to pivot our economy towards greater productivity and less reliance on population growth.
Yeah, I think then that diagnosis is correct, but I would point in the direction of, again, I think new technology is going to be the fundamental thing that's going to shift here. What we're sort of observing is a enormous demand for digital production, digital infrastructure for rebuilding industries. And again, we sort of see this very clearly in the industry that I'm in education, that is probably going to pivot significantly from a face-to-face thing that we all do in crowded rooms to something that is delivered on digital platforms, which means it can be global, which means it becomes an export industry far more easily, which means it becomes sort of far more competitive. And that kind of business model innovation built upon new tech infrastructure is the way in which we rebuild an economy that looks different, that it'll have different industries and different sectors and different comparative advantages in it. And Australia's is as well positioned as anyone is for this type of revolution. If we make those, the main thing standing in the way is sort of barriers to adoption of those technologies, which often comes from regulatory protections of existing business models or ways of doing things, whether this is occupational licensing or just various other forms of government permissioning of sectors and so on. So a lot of the sort of rent seeking in an economy is actually holding back innovation and adaptation, and where that adaptation is likely to come from is new technologies into the space. So, I mean, in a sense, this could be a huge opportunity for Australia if we can enable this type of rapid, innovative, entrepreneurial discovery and experimentation of new business models and industries.
Yeah, Dan, I think your point is right, and it's interesting. In the middle of a crisis, it's sort of hard to step back and see the macro level, how this fits into the broad sweep of Australian history, or the sort of cultural and economic criticisms that we've had over the last decade while we've been relatively prosperous. But it is really interesting to think about how this fits into that policy stagnation, that political and economic complacency that we have been talking about. Certainly since the Howard years, but much earlier as well. And one of the things that I've always been concerned about, as regular listeners will know, is the incredibly narrow debate that we're allowed to have in Australia, just even about like taxation matters and so forth. And No better example of that was when Malcolm Turnbull declared that he was comfortable with the states raising income taxes, a policy that lasted, I think, 8 hours or something like that before he had to roll it back after it was shouted down. But it's just a really powerful illustration of the fact that we were very uncomfortable talking about anything outside of incredibly narrow range of policies. But this crisis has dropped that taste for the status quo something just extraordinarily. And I've been looking at the sort of regulations that have been suspended during this crisis. It has gone almost without any comment, for example, that the content requirements imposed on Australian television for Australian content have been suspended during this crisis. Now, it's hard to imagine a more politically sensitive, more powerfully defended regulation than Australian content standards, yet they have been cancelled, or suspended at least, with almost no comment, just overnight. No one cares. And what I think, if we're to look at opportunities from this crisis, it's not nice to look at a crisis as an opportunity, but if we're to look at opportunities, it's that complacency may be broken. We have the opportunity to make the bigger decisions that we've needed to do so for the last couple of decades to get us genuine productivity boosts and economic growth.
The stakes are really high here, and one of the things I appreciate about what the authors of this book are trying to do is find a new language. You talk, for instance, about the difference between a V-shaped recovery, which is what some people are hoping for, or a U-shaped recovery, which is what more people are predicting, which is you have a dip and then a long flat line and then you go back up again. And as you point out, there's two problems with that. One is it could be an L-shaped recovery. You never come back up at all. But also, just returning back to where you were won't be sufficient. We'll have accumulated debt. And if you look through the various sectors of the Australian economy that make up significant proportions of GDP, say like tourism, education, which we'll have to find a whole new business model, hospitality, expect the baseline actually to be lower. And as we go in, as we approach $1 trillion worth of debt, which we'll get to very quickly, just arithmetically to be chugging along at 1.5% real growth, which is almost the best we can hope for under the model that we had, that's just not good enough. Australia will be mired, as you say in the book, in stagflation again. We'll manage to have high unemployment and low growth, and we'll see what happens with inflation. But we actually need that high growth scenario coming out of it. Otherwise, we'll never escape sort of the debt and low productivity trap that we'll find ourselves in. Just reverting back to where we were is not good enough.
Yeah, that's right. So it's got to be. So we describe it as a two-stage recovery, which actually looks like a square root graph. So we call it a square root recovery. So it's not V-form or a V-shaped recovery where the economy just bounces back, and it's not a U-shaped recovery. It's got to be a two-stage recovery. There's got to be the first instance where we allow the restaurants to open, we allow people to go back into their offices, and so forth. And that's where the debate is right now. But after that, there's got to be a huge period of high growth. And you're right, we can't accept 1 or 2% growth per year. We need to have the sort of growth that we are capable of having, that we've had in the past, in order to return us to relative prosperity, to pay off the extraordinary debt that we'll have accumulated, to pay off the extraordinary promises that we're probably going to have locked in. So, for example, where the federal government is now offering free childcare to parents, I don't see a world in which that gets abolished anytime soon. So we're going to have to pay for it. We're going to have to pay for the larger calls on social security that will be likely to be very permanent. So we're going to need some very, very vibrant private sector activity. We're going to need to be able to launch the private sector.
Yeah, because I would just comment on that. I think what this will look like is not a sort of mixed economy where you've got a sort of strong regulatory state governing a sort of well-known set of sectors that are controlled, but rather there's going to be a strong demand for a lot of public health and a lot of sort of the welfare state is probably going to need to be, or will be quite so strong and buttressed after this. But in order to pay for that, the market economy needs to be incredibly vigorous. So what we're going to have then is this sort of new two-layered thing that is this sort of base layer, which will be large, a welfare state in a lot of ways, and dealing with this huge amount of public debt, and then this enormously off the leash sort of free market system in order to pay for the base layer welfare state. Now that's not a mixed economy by any means. That's actually a sort of two-layer economy, and that's not what any notion of us going back to where we were before is going to be a disaster in trying to achieve that.
I think that's an interesting point, and it sort of picks up something that I was interested in discussing a little bit, which is how do you actually what is the framework that one would use to promote this set of ideas? So Jason sort of outlined what might be thought of as a Blairite third way kind of idea, which is we need the market economy in order to deliver, or in part anyway, to deliver some social services and also to help pay down debt. So we basically need, the economy needs to grow faster than our growth to our debt in order to be able to get that down. I also wonder whether it's about sort of communicating more about the importance of jobs and enterprise, small business creation, home ownership, things that touch people where they are in their lives. Because I think that rapid change and technological adaptation are actually very threatening to people. And because they mean that, a lot of people won't have control over these things, but their jobs and their lives will be changed pretty significantly. Some people will like it, some people won't like it, which is part of the reason why I think a lot of people are by nature a bit wary of rapid change. And so it's a question of, what would be the framework one would use to actually communicate this to the average person to bring to their attention that this is something that we might need to be considering.
I think a lot of it's already happened in the sense that, March was an incredible month. It was horrifying and terrifying, but also just incredible in the sense of a huge amount of change happened very quickly, globally. And in a lot of ways, just people figured out how to work from home. They figured out how to suddenly change behaviors that they've been doing all their lives in a very short order in order to deal with this crisis. So we've demonstrated that we can actually change very, very quickly when we need to. And I think, it's that spirit or that way of behaving that is going to continue. We've actually proven that it can already happen as this. The shift that needs to take place, though, is this notion of going back. This notion that was temporary adjustment to deal with a thing, and then everything goes back to normal afterwards. That's absolutely not what's going to happen.
Can I come in there too? I think it's a great question from Dan, and certainly what we're talking about today is a preferred pathway that I can see. One of the things that worries me is that there will be alternative narratives out there, and some of them are dodgy. Chris, in a future episode, we might come back to this National COVID-19 Coordination Commission that Scott Morrison has set up a few weeks ago, which is supposed to be sort of a private sector-led response to what we do, after the unfreeze. And I guess what worries me is there's a difference between planning on how you might achieve a recovery, which is what I think we've been talking about, as opposed to a planned recovery, which is what I think the push is going to be. This is a body chaired by Neville Power. It has Greg Combay on it, Jane Holton, Paul Little, Catherine Tanner, David Thodey, very much an insiders kind of thing. I've certainly seen already some of the press about it. People like Andrew Liveris and others seeing it as a great sign of hope, virtually for a revitalisation of industrial policy in Australia. I'm not saying that all the people involved in it want to go back to sort of the rent-seeking ways of protectionism, but there was certainly a sudden flash of inspiration that perhaps the door was open again. And this worries me that there will be these competing narratives. And in the book, you actually talk about that kind of old school industrial policy and, R&D tax rebates and national champions and all this kind of thing. Whereas the innovation that we do need, and it will include manufacturing, is not that kind of heavy manufacturing model from the past. It's the people that we're seeing with the agility to change their business models very rapidly just to cope with this pandemic, and hopefully will change their business models very rapidly to be ready for what's coming out the other side.
That's right. It's a classic fallacy, isn't it? So a government, a relatively pro-private enterprise government, identifies that the private sector is better at handling lots of things than the government sector is. So it takes people from the private sector and turns them into bureaucrats on the hope that they would bring some of the energy. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about taking CEOs and giving them power over the state, and therefore the private sector will solve our problems. Now, what we're much more interested in, and what we think is most likely to be effective, is going to be those sort of bottom-up entrepreneurial decisions. And it's the sort of thing that we're thinking about in the way that we've tackled the crisis already. So there's been a two-prong approach to handling social distancing. The first one has been the government setting rules about what we can and can't do, and setting the police to make sure that we're training our L-plater drivers in the right suburbs and all that sort of thing, and checking that we're not sitting on a bench recklessly. But then there's the other stuff which I'm really interested in, which is the stuff that the private sector has done, the stuff that retailers have set up independently of government mandates to protect their staff, to protect us from each other as necessary. So those perspex glass walls that we now see at point of service in retail stores, the spacing that we're now seeing, all these sorts of independent private decisions. And when we think about countries that have done this with those different models, then there's been the full lockdown model like Australia has, or the quasi full lockdown models. And then there's those countries that have decided not to have government-led lockdowns like Sweden. But in Sweden, they've done a lot of these private sector initiatives already. And those are the private sector things that are getting us through the crisis. And we've got to take lessons from that and say, well, they're also the ones that will get us out of the economic crisis as well. They are the entrepreneurial decisions, not just putting some mining magnate in charge of a reopening commission funded by the federal government.
Yeah, Chris, it's all of that, but it's also doing that in a digital economy, not in an industrial economy. The powers and capabilities that are made possible by digital platforms for payments and contracting and governance and organization and all of the sort of administrative layers of business are orders of magnitude better than they were decades ago in an industrial economy. And these are the sorts of opportunities that make it a lot easier to rapidly start businesses or pivot businesses or find ways to entrepreneurially discover innovation in this space. So the economic infrastructure now, digital economic infrastructure, makes the power of entrepreneurship so much more effective in this type of space, which is why there's just simply less need or less value in this type of high-level industrial planning commissions, that once upon a time, in the distant past, may have had a role in coordinating industry recovery, but they just don't now at all. They're almost irrelevant.
So we should say that, in fact, our approach to this is not uniformly shared. And Dan, I know that you've been looking at the letter, the public open letter written by a large number of Australian economists to the Prime Minister about how to tackle the crisis and how to think about the crisis. So why don't you tell our listeners about that?
Yeah, so this was a letter, an open letter written by well over 100 economists, all of whom were at universities, basically making the argument that we shouldn't start to end the social distancing measures that are in place and the associated economic lockdown that is the result of that, and indeed that we need to keep them in place for longer and that we shouldn't be sacrificing, I'm paraphrasing this part, shouldn't be sacrificing health for the sake of the economy. Now, again, I'll return to my earlier observations about the hibernation strategy. These academics are safely and gainfully employed and completely sheltered from any of the downside consequence of their views. And this is one of the, I think, existential problems that we face, not only with this crisis, but with democratic governance in general in Australia and in many parts of the Western world, which is that those who are making decisions aren't the ones that suffer the consequences of those decisions should they go badly. So what if we did extend the lockdown for 6 more months? Well, we know that would prolong unemployment and cause further social problems, psychological and physiological problems that have resulted from those lockdown measures. But those who are making the recommendations to undertake such a course of action are not the ones that are themselves going to suffer. And indeed, many of the expert class will benefit from this crisis. They will, in relative terms, have higher income. They'll have more power. They'll have more prestige. And what we'll see is a bigger gap between the mainstream of the country and the elites, because the elites really have forgotten about the values of mainstream Australia, what it is that people need to get by in their life, and are just completely removed and detached from any basis of reality that the average person encounters.
So I just want to clarify, I have not signed that letter, Dan, just so you know.
Yes, present company accepted, yeah. I think, when it comes to academia.
So Jason, you've also been looking at it, and I know you've got some interesting...
Yeah, it was a bizarre letter. I also haven't signed it, and I didn't sign it because it just strikes me as a very weird thing for economists to write that letter. Now, there's a sense in which it's a letter calling for a government to not do a thing that they were never intending on doing anyway. So it's not quite clear what the purpose of it is. This idea that science proceeds by consensus is also just nonsense as well. Like that's not how science is done. Or there's this notion that if we have some sort of mythical consensus will carry value here. But the broader point is what's underneath this, is this notion that no one's debating that there are horrible choices to be made. In every direction, it's bad. The relevance of thinking like an economist at this point in time is precisely because every choice is bad, and we need to weigh off the horrible choices in one direction against the horrible choices in a different direction, and trying to sort of understand how we make a very difficult decision through this. So, first of all, there are trade-offs. A shutdown economy is a very, very bad thing in different ways than the sort of public health crisis. Now, the other part of this is the notion that this will only be resolved with government action is also misleading here. The private sector and just people don't like getting infectious diseases. They will actively try and avoid that. You don't actually have to rely on law and legislation to try to enforce that. So there is a private ordering response here, and what the real balance here is what the relationship between those two things are. So I think it was a very strange letter for economists to make, essentially arguing that economics has nothing to say here, whereas there's a huge amount of relevance in thinking through this enormously difficult problem from an economic perspective.
Yeah.
Well, as long as we're piling on, I'll add my perspective. There was a very useful paper which little reported, but it came out from Business Council of Australia this week. They got Port Jackson partners to do some work, and it's one of the few instances I've seen where people have talked about the effect over time. It's another flaw in this idea of things freezing, because their point is that, well, sort of as a first order approximation, things can freeze. A restaurant can close and then reopen, or a factory can close and then reopen. And for a certain short period of time, perhaps that's true.
Yeah, a weekend or a public holiday, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And, maybe a month. We look at those charts of, how much operating cash does the average business have? And it differs by industry and so on. And these are sort of the first order effects. And then obviously as that gets longer and longer, the approximation doesn't hold, because you come back and lo and behold, those businesses have not survived. But what they also identified was the second order effect, which is, because I think the conception everyone on this podcast shares is that the economy is a very dynamic, interconnected, complex adaptive system, to use one jargon phrase. And this idea that whole industry, and as that starts to unravel, as different businesses fall over, the supply chains are interrupted. I read today, just for example, while everyone's talking about the airlines, and we have pictures circulating on the web of all the aeroplanes parked on the tarmac at Tullamarine Airport, a classic sort of hibernation model. The company that actually services all those airlines, Swissport, is in diabolical trouble and is laying off people, and when things allegedly unfreeze, may not actually have the capacity to have the guys with the table tennis bats and the baggage handlers and the ones who drive the planes around off the tarmac. So these sort of second order effects start to increase, dare I say it, exponentially. And so for these economists in their letter to just almost assume that we can just think of this as like a national accounts thing where there's just industry by industry. The economy doesn't work like that. It's a tremendously interconnected beast, and the longer the freeze goes, the more destructive it is. 6 months is more than twice as bad as 3 months.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's the role of an economist to identify that interconnected nature of our economic relationships. It's to be able to understand, even map those contracts, those supply chain relationships, and so forth. And you think, so there's not just the firm that maintains the airplanes. There's also the accounting firm that services that firm. And then there's the firms that service those firms as well. Or this huge network of relationships and supply chains. And so we've got the government now. So this is not something that Scott Morrison has fallen into, but a lot of governments around the world have been telling us that some industries are essential, some workers are more essential, some firms do more essential things. In fact, for forever, progressives have been trying to divide. Oh well, we don't really need that sort of industry. We don't need those sorts of products. Those are excessive or luxurious or wasteful, or what have you. I think this crisis is showing us really vividly that it's all connected. Every firm ultimately is connected to every other firm. Every worker has some economic relationship, however how distant, with everybody else. And you can't just take some of them and put them aside. You can't just shut down companies and assume that all the other companies are going to be just as productive or just as successful or just as profitable or employ just as many people. I think that explaining that web of connections, that's the job of an economist, and to explain that making those sorts of decisions, maybe even if they were the right decisions to make, have awful trade-offs, not denying those trade-offs, but to identify those trade-offs.
So I might take this opportunity. I promised at the top of the show that we would come back to the immediate problem before us, which is before we can even get to the ascending part of the square root recovery that we want, we first need to find our way from phase 1 to phase 2. And what we've talked about on the podcast, Jason, in recent weeks is that we now have this paradox. We started off flattening the curve, but we were so successful that there's this mission creep now, and more politicians and health experts are saying, and Grattan Institute are saying, well, this is a chance to totally eliminate the virus in Australia. So they've shifted the goalposts and then hidden them, as I think the IPO has been saying. So we have that, and so we now have, in many ways is a very vulnerable Australian population. Very vulnerable to the virus, that is, still in lockdown, and the goalpost being shifted. It's not clear to me how the government will actually find its way out of that. They're promising that they'll start doing so in 3 or 4 weeks. But measures like yesterday allowing elective surgery again is not, to me, an example of unfreezing an economy. This is just more sort of administrative tinkering with the COVID-19 response. How do we actually get out of this trap that we've actually made for ourselves?
Yeah, that's a hard one.
Yeah, sorry. I did throw that one on you.
Let me try and solve that one for you all. So the first thing is that everyone's holding out hope for is vaccine, right? So until the virus goes away, there's no such thing as the virus going away. What we mean is we develop a vaccine and everyone becomes protected against the presence of the virus. So that's, what is that, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, uncertain amount of time in the future. Up to that point, the next thing is quarantine, that you build you don't let anything in or out of the country. Now that's a whole other level of difficulty. Just if we just go, let's open up surgery again. Well, a lot of the components of that surgery, whether it's the sort of anesthetic inputs or surgeons themselves, may well come from overseas. So we're talking some kind of autarky that will need to be imposed. That's hard in one way, but the other way is it'll make us. There's a whole lot of things that Australia is not self-sufficient in, and in an enormously complex global economy, there's almost nothing that we are completely self-sufficient in. So there's a huge cost and difficulty associated with that. But this, short of those sorts of extreme measures, there really is no way from to be consistent about complete public safety. So the other option is what Sweden is doing, is that you go back to that identify vulnerable parts of the population, or self-identify and protect those. I just don't see how we get from here to the next phase without switching a strategy to something more like that.
I think that's right. And one of the interesting things that Jason has touched on is, I think this, and this will be a part of the ongoing debate over the next weeks and months, is this interconnected global economic system, which has been the basis of fairly substantial wealth creation, has also arguably created a lot of local vulnerabilities, and whether the current arrangements of that order is something that will sustain in the post-COVID-19 economic world. Clearly, there's questions being raised about China's role and place in that trading system, and whether we need to be reorientating some of our supply chains, at least out of China, and towards countries that have more friendly, or at least more based on a set of governing values and cultural values that are closer to our own, which is an important consideration. And I think there's also this, what's become apparent to me anyway, is the sort of contradiction between globalization and localism. They're two things that are quite distinct, and I would argue you can't really have both. So one of the main ways in which you achieve a low regulatory environment, for example, is through decentralized governance. And one of the major challenges we have in Australia is, of course, we have a highly centralized governing regime, which is, Scott mentioned the old vertical fiscal imbalance, which is basically the Commonwealth raises a disproportionate share of funds, which I believe is the highest in the world, even greater than Canada, in the sense of how substantial the Commonwealth government role is. But that's in part arguably necessary to navigate the globalized economic world in which we live. And so one of the challenges that we face, and this is one of the not necessarily contradictions, but different points of view on the right at the moment, is, well, if we want to have local governance, we're going to have to have some element of self-sustaining local economies. Otherwise, it's difficult to see how you're going to have the localized industry and necessary critical mass in order to sustain that decentralized approach. So that's not something that I think we've really figured out exactly what to do, but I'm not convinced that more globalization and more of the same is something that's going to be necessarily the best answer to our troubles.
So Dan, can I just push back on that? Because I think what you're describing is accurate in an industrial economy, where the main things that are moving are physical commodities and people, and whereas in a digital economy, that doesn't apply. There's no real sort of hazard and risks in this way when we're moving bits around the world. It's atoms that are the problem here. And again, the sort of nation-state regulatory environment is again optimized and built around this notion that it's physical things, it's atoms and commodities and so on that's moving around. We can build digital regulatory global platforms in the private sector. That's the whole sort of blockchain crypto space is nothing but that. And what that enables us to do is to have a global internet-based trading economy that is moving digital objects around the world that are perfectly fine, completely safe from a sort of pandemic-y perspective in terms of these types of lockdowns. But the governance itself is platform governance. It's on the digital platforms themselves, which can be privately built. They're voluntary. You opt in, opt out of them. So I think we're at sort of an interesting point in history as well, where we've got this pivot between an industrial world order and its type of an industrial globalization versus a new digital global economy and digital globalization. And digital globalization is fine. It's working really well. It's the industrial globalization that's failing. And this pandemic has put a wedge right in the middle of that we're still struggling to unpack here. And I think globalization is not the problem per se. It's industrial globalization that's been threatened.
I think there's a trap here. So what we need to do right now, or what we will need to do if we're going to return to 2019's prosperity, is absolutely maximize economic growth. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't make geopolitical decisions as well, and we can't go into it naively, a naive form of globalization. But we also have to be really, really careful that we are not making decisions on the basis of a once-in-a-century pandemic. We've had a massive amount of economic growth and development and prosperity precisely because of that globalization that we've enjoyed over the last few decades. And we need to ensure, if we're going to get out of this, we need to ensure that we're not deliberately suppressing our economy in order to pursue other potentially mistaken goals. And I just think about the case for protectionism. So a lot of people have argued that the case for protectionism is stronger, or at least the case for domestic manufacturing is stronger in a country like Australia, because we've discovered that we can't make our own face masks, or that we're being supplied a lot of our antibiotics or what have you from around the world, and not just China, but Germany and these other big industrial powers. But when I hear that argument, I can't help but think we had protectionism. In fact, we had protectionism for the vast majority of the 20th century, and we didn't build face masks, we didn't build antibiotics, we built cars, we built automobiles, and the reason we built that is because policymakers wanted to give cushy union jobs to to manufacturing unions and so forth. So even if you had the next government decided that it was a good idea to build more local manufacturing, it wouldn't be driven by public health measures. It would be driven by political incentives, and those political incentives take us away from ideal policymaking and towards politically motivated car manufacturing, for instance.
But isn't globalization also a politically motivated policy? I mean, it gets back to a fundamental conception of liberty, which is whether you sort of subscribe to the natural rights concept or a different conception of where our liberties come from. But I would argue that everything that we have, all the economic and social arrangements that we have, are the conscious decision made by people, either in their private capacity or by governments. It's not. I just sort of push back against the idea that a completely unfettered, say, global market economy is a natural state of the world. As many, and I'm not disputing the substantial and very important benefits that have accrued from that. I'm not disputing that nor arguing for protectionism, but I'm sort of just arguing against a little bit the concept that there's a natural state of the world and that any deviation from that is a political decision, but any movement towards that preferred state of the world is not a political decision. They're both political decisions.
I don't know. I don't know that it's a natural state of the world, but it's definitely a liberty-minded state of the world. Insofar as I want the right to be able to trade with people overseas. I want the right to be able to trade with people overseas without the government taking a cut, which is, of course, a tariff, or the government imposing a quota, or the government preventing me from making an exchange with someone in Germany or the United States or Chile or China. I want to be able to have the right to do that, because that's a private relationship between those two independent people. It shouldn't have the government involved. So I think it's a misleading path to go down to say that, well, it's a claim on what the natural state of affairs should be. It's much more, yes, it's a political decision, but it's a political decision to allow me the liberty to make my own choices about who I trade with.
Yeah, but
whether it's natural, or not, it's a liberty thing.
Well,
I'm going to jump in, guys, because I have a slightly different take. I think the issue that Dan's raised is a legitimate one, but to me, it doesn't necessarily lead to. We don't need to relitigate old debates. I mean, this is something that is addressed in business terms as just supply chain resilience. I mean, with the issues that have come up, say with China in the last few years, very complex physical products and also services that are assembled for consumers, with parts or inputs from all over the world. Companies have been focusing on the resilience of their supply chain and realizing that you can't just use a simple decision rule of, least cost wins every time. Companies that have been doing that have been burnt by IP theft, but also availability. I think I certainly do think that this has highlighted that a world built on always lowest cost inputs, always just in time manufacturing is probably not the world that we're going to get back to for quite a while. And I think nations too. I think some questions around supply chain resilience are reasonable questions to ask. Just as, say, Jim Molan has campaigned for years about meeting benchmarks for crude oil reserves, not because crude oil is expensive. It's certainly not. It's very cheap at the moment.
It's not just cheap.
But because if the tankers can't actually arrive in the country, then you run out of petrol and diesel very, very quickly. That is a supply chain resilience question that we as a nation have to grapple on. And I think, and we'll grapple with it in other things too. I suspect that we'll decide in 6 months' time that the medical device issues are not as big as we thought they were. I mean, God, how many companies around the world are now furiously building ventilators just at the time when no one is actually on ventilators because A, the number of acute cases is not as high as we thought it was going to be, and B, they don't necessarily do as much good as we thought they would do. So, there was an example of a reaction to an identified issue in the supply chain that, we won't even be talking about it in a year's time. We won't need a government strategy for ventilators.
Yeah, that's right. And the idea, obviously, the private sector has found this hard enough to plan what it needs. The idea that the government would be better at doing so is obviously nuts. Now, I know Jason has a hard deadline to leave, so I think we should probably wrap it up. But I did want to point out, which I did not at the top of the show.
You will take the last word.
I will take the last
Chris?
word, of course. But I did want to point out, because I failed to do so at the top of the show, that Jason and I aren't the only authors of this book. This book would not have been possible without our co-author.
But what's the title of the book? You haven't actually told us what the title is.
The book is Cryoeconomics: How to Unfreeze an Economy After a Pandemic. It's written by Jason, myself, as well as Darcy Allen, Aaron Lane, and Sinclair Davidson, all names well known to IPA audiences and free market.
All, in fact, adjunct fellows of the IPA. Well done, gentlemen.
And it's going to be published with the American Institute for Economic Research in coming weeks. We've literally just sent the manuscript off, and we're hoping that it comes out as soon as possible, because as we can see, there is a need right now to talk about the policies that will set us up for prosperity once again.
Certainly is. Thank you all for coming onto this show via various digital devices. A big thank you also to Josh Stranger for wrangling the tech. Notwithstanding anything Jason said, I'm not sure the digital responses necessarily led to 100% perfect solutions, but we do approach perfection more and more with every episode of Looking Forward in this new working from home environment. Don't forget, Looking Forward is a product of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you'd like to join or donate, understand our research, please do go to ipa.org.au, where you'll also find some bios on the people that you've been listening to today. A big thank you to my co-host, Chris Berg.
Thank you, Scott.
Our special guest, Jason Potts.
Thank you, Scott.
And our Director of Research, Daniel Wild.
Thank you, Scott. Pleasure.
And a big thank you to you, the listener. You've been listening to Looking Forward. We'll be back with more next week.